The Queen returns. Early. The capital planet, Aurelian, was known across the galaxy as one of the most powerful worlds in the Empire. Its cities were filled with shining towers, glowing sky bridges, and enormous royal structures that floated above the ground like symbols of ancient power. At the center of the capital stood the royal palace of Queen Zylaria, a massive structure built from bright silver stone and crystal glass that reflected the light of 3 nearby moons. Inside the palace, hundreds of workers, guards, and officials carried out their daily duties. The palace was always busy, but on this night the halls were unusually quiet. Most of the royal staff believed they still had 2 more days before the Queen returned from her long diplomatic mission across the outer star systems. Queen Zylaria had been away for several weeks meeting with leaders from distant alien civilizations. During that time, the palace had been managed by royal ministers and security commanders. Everything had appeared normal. The royal nursery was protected by elite guards, and the Queen's 4 young children, her beloved Quadruplets, were under constant protection. At least that was what everyone believed. In one of the long service corridors of the palace, a human worker slowly pushed a cleaning cart across the polished floor. His name was Daniel Carter, and most people in the palace barely noticed him. To them, he was simply the human janitor who cleaned the lower halls and maintenance rooms. Humans were rare in the Aurelian Empire. Many alien species saw them as strange and unpredictable. So some believed humans were dangerous because of their history of wars and survival on harsh planets. Because of this, most humans in the Empire worked quiet jobs far away from important political positions. Daniel preferred it that way. He kept his head down and focused on his work. Every day he cleaned the corridors, repaired broken equipment, and made sure the maintenance systems of the palace continued working smoothly. He spoke politely to the guards and palace staff, but he rarely joined their conversations. Many people assumed Daniel was just a simple worker. They did not know much about his past. Late that night, Daniel was finishing his cleaning shift when he heard a loud sound far above the palace. At first, it sounded like distant thunder, but within seconds the entire building vibrated slightly as powerful engines echoed across the sky. Daniel stopped pushing the cart. He slowly looked up toward the ceiling. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a royal starship entering the landing bay. Within seconds, palace communication speakers activated across the corridors. "Attention, palace staff. The royal flagship has arrived. Queen Zylaria has returned to the palace earlier than scheduled." The message repeated again through the halls. Workers began moving quickly through the corridors as everyone rushed to prepare for the Queen's unexpected arrival. Servants adjusted decorations, security officers rushed to their positions, and ministers hurried toward the main throne hall. Then Daniel quietly pushed his cleaning cart against the wall and stepped aside to allow the busy staff to pass. The Queen returning early was unusual, but it did not concern him much, until he noticed something strange. 2 royal guards rushed past him toward the upper floors. Their faces looked tense. One of them was speaking urgently through a communication device on his armor. "Confirm the nursery security team immediately," the guard said quickly. The other guard replied in a worried voice. "We are trying. They are not responding." Daniel's attention sharpened immediately. He did not move, but he listened carefully as the guards disappeared around the corner. A few seconds later, the lights in the corridor flickered. Once, twice. Then they returned to normal. Daniel slowly looked up at the ceiling lights. Maintenance systems in the palace almost never malfunctioned. The building had multiple backup systems designed to prevent exactly that type of problem. Something about this situation felt wrong. Daniel turned his cart slowly and walked toward the nearby elevator that led to the upper palace floors. As a maintenance worker, he had permission to move through most service areas of the palace, including corridors close to the royal nursery. When the elevator doors opened, Daniel stepped inside and pressed the button for the nursery level. The elevator moved upward in silence. When the doors opened again, Daniel immediately noticed something unusual. The hallway outside the nursery was dark. Several lights along the corridor were turned off, and the usual guards standing outside the royal nursery door were missing. Daniel frowned slightly. That had never happened before. The Queen's children were the most protected individuals in the entire empire. The nursery guards were trained elite soldiers who never left their posts without replacement. But now the corridor was empty. Daniel stepped carefully into the hallway. Then he heard something. Soft footsteps, coming from inside the nursery. Daniel slowly moved closer to the door. The door was slightly open. Inside, the room looked peaceful. Toys were scattered across the floor, and 4 small alien children were playing together near the center of the room. The Queen's quadruplets. They looked completely unaware that their guards had vanished. Daniel's instincts began to warn him that something was very wrong. The lights in the corridor flickered again. Then, from somewhere deep in the palace, a distant alarm system began to activate. Daniel looked at the children again. If someone was planning an attack inside the palace, the royal heirs would be the first target. Without hesitation, Daniel stepped inside the nursery. The children looked up at him with curious eyes. "Hey there," Daniel said calmly. One of the children smiled at him. Daniel quickly looked around the hallway again. Still no guards, still no security. His decision came instantly. "All right, kids," he said quietly. "Looks like we're going on a little adventure." And within minutes, the human janitor quietly led the Queen's 4 children away from the royal nursery. Just moments before the danger inside the palace would finally reveal itself. "I'm the human janitor." Daniel Carter moved quickly but carefully through the quiet service corridors of the royal palace, guiding the 4 young royal children behind him. The quadruplets were still very small, curious about everything around them, and too young to understand the danger that might be unfolding inside the palace. To them, this simply felt like an unexpected late-night adventure, with the friendly human who sometimes waved at them while cleaning the hallways. Daniel knew that every second mattered. If his instincts were correct, the palace security failure was not an accident. Someone had planned something dangerous, and the nursery would have been the first place attackers would check. The maintenance corridors were different from the main palace halls. They were narrower, dimly lit, and rarely used by nobles or visitors. Pipes and energy cables ran along the walls, and small service doors connected to storage rooms and repair stations used by palace workers. Daniel had spent months cleaning these corridors, fixing broken equipment, and learning every corner of the building that most people never noticed. That knowledge now became his greatest advantage. The quadruplets followed him with quiet curiosity. Their glowing eyes reflected the dim corridor lights as they tried to keep up with the tall human moving quickly ahead of them. One of the children held a small toy that had been left behind in the nursery, while another quietly asked a question in the soft language of their species. Daniel did not fully understand their words, but he recognized the tone of confusion. To them, this situation was strange, but not frightening yet. But Daniel stopped near a large metal door marked Maintenance Sector C-17 and quickly opened it. Inside was a storage and repair room used by palace workers. Shelves filled with cleaning supplies, toolkits, and mechanical parts lined the walls. The room was small, but it had only one entrance and strong reinforced walls. For the moment, it would be a safe place to hide. "All right, everyone inside," Daniel said calmly while guiding the children into the room. The quadruplets entered without hesitation, curious about the unfamiliar environment. One of them immediately began examining a pile of metal tools resting on a nearby table, while another looked around at the shelves filled with equipment. Their natural curiosity reminded Daniel how young they truly were. These children were not soldiers or politicians, and they were simply kids who had been born into one of the most powerful families in the galaxy. Daniel closed the door carefully and locked the internal security bolt. Then he moved toward a control panel near the wall and disabled the automatic hallway sensors connected to the room. If anyone scanned the corridor for movement, the system would now show the maintenance room as inactive. For a moment, Daniel stood quietly, listening. The palace was too quiet. Normally at this hour, the building would still have movement from late-working staff, security patrols, and maintenance crews finishing their duties. But now the silence felt unnatural, as if something inside the palace had frozen. Then he heard it, a distant sound echoing faintly through the walls. Footsteps. Many footsteps, moving quickly through the upper levels of the palace. Daniel slowly walked to the storage table and picked up a small handheld scanner used for checking maintenance signals in the palace systems. He activated the device and began scanning the nearby security network. The screen flickered as it tried to connect with the palace monitoring systems. At first, the signal showed nothing unusual. Then the screen changed. Several security nodes inside the palace had been manually disabled. Daniel frowned slightly as he studied the information. Whoever had done this knew exactly which systems controlled the nursery corridors and royal access routes. That meant the attackers were not random criminals. This was an organized operation. Inside the room, the quadruplets had begun playing quietly with some harmless tools and metal parts Daniel had moved away from the shelves. One of the children picked up a small cleaning robot and laughed as it rolled across the floor. Their laughter echoed softly inside the maintenance room. Daniel watched them for a moment, and despite the tension building in the palace, he felt a small sense of relief. They were safe for now, but that safety would not last long if the attackers realized the nursery was empty. Daniel moved toward a wall panel and quietly opened it, revealing several cables connected to the palace internal cameras. Maintenance workers sometimes used these ports to repair damaged security systems. Daniel connected his scanner to the cable and attempted to access the nearby hallway cameras. After a few seconds, the screen activated. The image appeared. Daniel's expression became serious immediately. The camera feed showed several armed figures moving through the palace corridors. Their armor was dark and unfamiliar, and their weapons were clearly military-grade energy rifles. They were moving carefully, checking rooms and scanning doorways as they advanced deeper into the palace. They were searching for something. Daniel already knew what that something was: the Queen's children. He slowly turned his head and looked at the quadruplets again. They were still laughing and playing on the floor, unaware that armed attackers were only a few corridors away. Daniel took a deep breath and closed the wall panel. His instincts had been right. This was not a simple security problem. This was an assassination attempt. And right now, the only person standing between the attackers and the royal heirs was a human janitor. Daniel walked back toward the center of the room and sat down near the children. He forced a calm smile so they would not sense his concern. One of the quadruplets handed him the small cleaning robot, clearly expecting him to join their game. Daniel gently rolled the robot across the floor, making the children laugh again. But while he played with them, his mind was already planning what he would do next, because he knew something the attackers did not. Humans were very good at surviving dangerous situations, and Daniel Carter had once been trained to fight wars. Shadows in the palace. Inside the small maintenance room, the quiet laughter of the Queen's quadruplets echoed softly while Daniel Carter sat on the floor beside them, pretending to focus on the small mechanical toy rolling across the ground. To the children, everything still felt like a harmless game. They were too young to understand the danger that had entered the palace. But Daniel's attention was no longer on the toy. His mind was focused on the images he had just seen on the security scanner. Armed attackers were moving through the palace corridors. They were organized, calm, and clearly trained. This was not the work of desperate criminals. Whoever planned this operation had studied the palace security systems carefully. They had disabled the cameras around the nursery and removed the guards before anyone could react. The only mistake they had made was not expecting someone like Daniel Carter to notice the signs early. When Daniel slowly stood up and walked back toward the wall panel where the maintenance cables connected to the palace network. The quadruplets watched him curiously, but they remained calm, sitting together with the tools and parts scattered across the floor. Daniel reopened the panel and reconnected the handheld scanner to the internal camera system. The screen flickered again. A new image appeared. This time, the camera showed a corridor only 2 floors above their location. Several armored attackers were moving carefully through the hallway. Their helmets scanned the surroundings while one of them carried a small device that looked like a tracking scanner. Daniel immediately understood what it was. They were searching for the children. The nursery had already been checked. The attackers had found it empty, and now they were expanding their search through the palace. Daniel studied the camera feed closely. There were 6 of them in that corridor alone, and if the rest of the palace was under attack, there were probably more teams moving through different areas of the building. The rebels were moving with discipline, checking rooms methodically while maintaining communication with each other. Daniel disconnected the scanner and closed the wall panel again. The situation had become more dangerous than he first thought. If the attackers continued searching long enough, they would eventually reach the maintenance corridors. These areas were rarely used, but professional soldiers would not ignore them forever. Daniel looked around the room carefully. The maintenance sector contained tools, metal containers, and repair equipment, but it was not designed to defend against armed attackers. The door was strong, but it would not survive long against energy weapons. He needed to prepare. Daniel walked toward a long metal workbench and began examining the tools stored there. Screwdrivers, cutting torches, small mechanical clamps, and power cables were arranged across the surface. To most palace workers, these were simple repair tools, but to someone with military training, they were potential defensive equipment. He picked up a compact plasma cutter used for repairing damaged pipes. The tool produced a short but powerful beam capable of cutting through metal. It was not designed as a weapon, but in close quarters it could be extremely dangerous. Daniel placed the plasma cutter inside his belt. Next, he examined a small energy battery used for emergency maintenance systems. With a few adjustments, the battery could be connected to the door control panel and used to overload the locking system. If someone tried to force the door open, the energy surge might buy him a few extra seconds. Daniel quickly connected the battery to the internal door circuit and sealed the control panel again. While he worked, one of the quadruplets walked over and tugged gently on his sleeve. The child looked up at him with large, glowing eyes, clearly wondering what he was doing. Daniel knelt down slightly so he was at the same height as the small alien child. "Hey there," he said quietly with a calm smile. "Just fixing some things." The child watched him for a moment, then smiled and returned to the others. Within seconds, the children were playing again, stacking small metal pieces into strange shapes while laughing softly. Daniel watched them for a moment. Despite everything happening in the palace, their laughter filled the room with warmth. It reminded him of something important. These were not political symbols or royal heirs in that moment. They were simply children, and someone had come to harm them. Daniel slowly stood up again and walked toward the door, placing his hand against the cold metal surface. He listened carefully. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, he heard something through the hallway outside. Footsteps, slow, careful, moving closer. Daniel's body immediately became still. The attackers had reached the maintenance level. He quietly turned off the overhead lights inside the room, leaving only a dim emergency light glowing from the far corner. The room became darker, making it harder to see clearly from the hallway if someone opened the door. The quadruplets looked up in confusion when the lights changed, but Daniel quickly motioned for them to remain quiet. His calm expression helped them understand that this was part of the game. The footsteps outside the hallway grew louder. Then they stopped. For several seconds there was only silence. Daniel could almost hear his own heartbeat as he stood beside the door, holding the plasma cutter tightly in his hand. A shadow moved beneath the bottom edge of the door. Someone was standing outside. Then a mechanical voice spoke through the hallway communicator. "Search this sector." Daniel slowly took a deep breath. The attackers had found the maintenance corridor, and they were about to start opening doors. Inside the small maintenance room, the only thing standing between the royal children and the soldiers searching the palace was a human janitor who once knew how to fight a war. The human makes a stand. The footsteps outside the maintenance room door grew louder as the attackers moved through the corridor. Daniel Carter stood perfectly still beside the metal door, his hand gripping the plasma cutter while his eyes remained fixed on the handle. Inside the room, the dim emergency light cast long shadows across the walls, and the quiet laughter from earlier had completely disappeared. The Queen's quadruplets now sat close together near the far side of the room, watching Daniel carefully. Even though they were too young to understand the full danger, and they could sense that something serious was happening. Daniel listened closely as the attackers searched the nearby rooms. Metal doors opened and closed down the corridor as the soldiers checked each maintenance sector one by one. Their movements were slow and careful, like hunters searching for hidden prey. Every few seconds he could hear the faint sound of scanning equipment sweeping the walls, probably searching for life signs or energy signals. Whoever had sent these soldiers was clearly determined to find the royal children. Daniel's mind moved quickly as he reviewed the situation. The attackers already knew the nursery was empty. That meant they would not leave the palace until they found the quadruplets or confirmed they were somewhere else. Eventually, they would reach this door. When that happened, Daniel would have only seconds to react. He quietly walked to the corner of the room and lifted a heavy metal storage container, dragging it slowly across the floor toward the door. The sound was soft, but deliberate. He placed the container beside the entrance so that if the attackers forced their way inside, the obstacle would slow them down for a brief moment. It would not stop trained soldiers, but sometimes a few seconds could decide the outcome of a fight. Next, he returned to the workbench and examined the tools again. Among the scattered equipment, he found a compact magnetic clamp used for holding broken pipes in place during repairs. Daniel quickly connected the clamp to a small power cable and attached it to the inside wall near the doorframe. If someone stepped inside too quickly, the energized clamp could create a sudden magnetic pull strong enough to disrupt metal armor or weapons for a moment. It was a simple trap, but sometimes simple solutions worked best. Behind him, one of the quadruplets walked closer, watching his movements with curiosity. The small alien child gently tugged on his sleeve again. Daniel looked down and forced a reassuring smile. "Everything's okay," he whispered softly. "Just stay back here for me." The child nodded and returned to the others. They gathered near the corner where Daniel had placed several blankets and toolboxes to create a small hiding space. He had learned long ago that children often stayed calmer if they felt they were part of a quiet game. To them, this was still a strange nighttime adventure. Outside in the hallway, the footsteps finally stopped directly in front of the maintenance room door. Daniel felt his muscles tighten. A mechanical scanner beeped softly outside. The attackers were checking the room. One of them spoke in a low voice through a helmet communicator. "This room shows life signs." Daniel knew what that meant. The soldiers had found them. For a moment, the hallway went silent again. Daniel could imagine the soldiers positioning themselves on both sides of the door, preparing to enter. Professional fighters always avoided rushing blindly into unknown spaces. Then the door handle moved slightly. The attackers were testing the lock. The reinforced bolt Daniel had activated earlier held firm, but it would not last long if they used stronger equipment. Daniel stepped backward slowly, positioning himself beside the workbench where he had the clearest view of the entrance. The plasma cutter rested firmly in his hand, its small power core glowing faintly as he activated the beam. A thin blue line of energy extended from the tool, humming quietly in the dim room. Outside, one of the soldiers spoke again. "Door is locked," another voice replied, calm and cold. "Open it." A loud metallic sound echoed through the hallway as a cutting device pressed against the door. Sparks began falling from the metal surface while the attackers slowly burned through the lock mechanism. Daniel watched the door carefully, calculating the exact moment they would break through. Behind him, the quadruplets remained silent, their glowing eyes watching the humans standing between them and the entrance. Even though they did not fully understand the danger, they could sense that Daniel was protecting them. The cutting tool outside finally broke through the lock. With a heavy sound, the door burst open. The first soldier stepped into the room with his weapon raised, expecting to find frightened palace workers hiding inside. Instead, he saw a calm human warrior standing ready. Before the soldier could react, Daniel triggered the magnetic clamp on the wall. The sudden surge of energy pulled sharply at the metal armor and weapon the attacker carried, throwing off his balance for a split second. That was all Daniel needed. He moved forward instantly, striking the soldier's weapon with the plasma cutter. The hot beam sliced through the rifle's power chamber, causing the weapon to spark violently and drop to the floor. The attacker stumbled backward in shock as Daniel pushed him aside with a powerful shove. Two more soldiers rushed through the doorway, raising their weapons toward the human. Daniel grabbed the heavy metal container he had placed earlier and shoved it directly into their path. The obstacle slowed them down just enough for him to move again. The small maintenance room exploded into action. Energy blasts fired through the doorway as the attackers tried to regain control, but the narrow entrance made it difficult for them to move freely. Daniel used the confined space to his advantage, striking quickly and retreating before the soldiers could fully aim their weapons. The rebels had expected an easy capture. Instead, they had walked into a fight with someone who knew how to survive battles. And Daniel Carter had already decided one thing. No one was reaching those children. The human who would not step back. The moment the first rebel soldier fell back from the broken weapon, the small maintenance room erupted into chaos. Bright flashes of energy filled the narrow doorway as the attackers tried to regain control of the situation. Daniel Carter moved quickly across the room, staying out of the direct line of fire while the soldiers attempted to push inside. The confined space worked in his favor. Only one or two attackers could enter at a time, preventing them from using their numbers to overwhelm him immediately. The first soldier, who had been knocked aside, tried to recover his balance and reach for a sidearm attached to his armor. Daniel reacted instantly. Before the rebel could lift the weapon, the human lunged forward and struck the man's wrist with the plasma cutter's energized edge. The heat from the beam forced the attacker to release the weapon immediately, sending it sliding across the floor. Daniel kicked the rifle away and pushed the soldier back into the hallway, momentarily blocking the entrance with the rebel's own body. Behind that soldier, two more attackers attempted to force their way into the room. One fired a quick burst from his energy rifle, sending bright beams across the workbench and shelves. Tools and metal parts exploded off the walls as the shots struck the equipment. Daniel ducked behind a large storage crate and rolled across the floor to avoid the second burst. Even though he no longer carried military gear, the instincts he had learned during his years as a human soldier had never truly disappeared. From the corner of the room, the quadruplets watched with wide, glowing eyes. They stayed close together exactly where Daniel had told them to remain. The children were frightened now, but none of them cried out. Some instinct seemed to tell them that silence was important. Daniel knew he could not hold the attackers back forever. The rebels were trained fighters, and eventually more of them would reach the maintenance level. If that happened, the small room would become impossible to defend. He needed to slow them down long enough for palace security to respond to the alarms spreading through the building. The second rebel soldier stepped through the doorway with his weapon raised, trying to get a clear shot at Daniel. The human waited until the attacker moved fully inside the room. Then Daniel grabbed a long metal tool from the floor and threw it directly toward the soldier's helmet. The sudden distraction forced the attacker to shift his aim slightly. In that brief moment, Daniel rushed forward and slammed the plasma cutter against the soldier's rifle barrel. The weapon exploded in a shower of sparks. The rebel staggered backward as the damaged rifle discharged useless energy into the ceiling. Daniel used the opportunity to shove the attacker into the wall, knocking him unconscious before he could recover. But the hallway outside was now filled with movement. More footsteps echoed through the corridor. Reinforcements were arriving. One of the rebels shouted an order from outside the room. The voice sounded calm but impatient. "Secure the children. Do not damage them." Daniel's expression hardened as he heard the command. That confirmed everything he had suspected. These attackers were not simply trying to kill the Queen's heirs. They wanted to capture them alive. Kidnapping the royal children would give the rebels powerful leverage over the Empire. That was something Daniel could never allow. Another soldier pushed into the doorway, firing rapidly to force Daniel back into the room. The blasts shattered the workbench and punched glowing holes into the wall panels. Daniel grabbed the heavy metal crate he had used earlier and pushed it across the floor again, blocking the entrance temporarily. The rebel fired repeatedly into the obstacle, trying to destroy it. Daniel quickly moved to the control panel near the door where he had connected the emergency battery earlier. With a few fast adjustments, he overloaded the circuit. Sparks burst from the panel as the energy surged through the doorframe. The moment the rebel soldier pushed against the crate to force his way inside, the electrical surge activated. The metal frame of the doorway flashed brightly, sending a powerful shock through the armor of the attacker standing in contact with it. The soldier cried out as the surge threw him backward into the corridor. For a brief moment, the hallway went silent again. Daniel knew the rebels would not remain stunned for long. He turned toward the quadruplets and crouched beside them. "Listen carefully," he said quietly, keeping his voice calm despite the battle outside. "Stay right here behind these boxes. No matter what happens, stay down and stay quiet." The children nodded nervously. One of them reached out and held Daniel's sleeve for a moment before letting go. Daniel stood up again and looked toward the doorway. More shadows moved in the corridor outside. The rebels were regrouping. A new voice spoke from the hallway, deeper and more controlled than the others. "So, the human janitor fights like a soldier." Daniel recognized the tone immediately. That voice belonged to someone in command. A tall figure stepped into view outside the doorway. Unlike the other attackers, this one wore heavier armor marked with the symbol of the rebel faction. His helmet visor glowed faintly red as he studied the damaged room and the fallen soldiers inside. The rebel leader had arrived. He looked directly at Daniel and spoke again with cold confidence. "You cannot protect them forever. Human." Daniel tightened his grip on the plasma cutter and stepped forward into the center of the room. He did not respond with words. He simply stood between the rebel leader and the 4 children behind him. And in that moment, the leader of the attackers finally understood something important. The man they had dismissed as a palace janitor was not going to move. The Queen learns the truth. The rebel leader stood just outside the broken doorway, studying the small maintenance room with calm, calculating eyes behind his glowing helmet visor. Around him, several injured soldiers struggled to stand, while others raised their weapons again, waiting for the next command. The narrow hallway was filled with tension. Sparks from damaged wall panels flickered across the metal floor, while the echo of distant palace alarms continued through the corridors. Inside the room, Daniel Carter stood quietly, the plasma cutter still glowing faintly in his hand. His breathing remained steady, but his mind was working quickly. He understood that this man outside the door was not just another soldier. The rebel leader moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought many battles and expected to win them. The leader slowly stepped forward into the doorway, his heavy armor reflecting the dim emergency light inside the room. His eyes moved briefly past Daniel toward the corner where the quadruplets were hiding. The children remained silent behind the stacked containers, exactly where Daniel had told them to stay. "Ah, so this is where the heirs of the Empire are hiding," the rebel leader said calmly. Daniel did not answer. The rebel leader tilted his head slightly, as if studying the human more carefully. "Interesting," he continued. "Our intelligence report said the palace had only guards and servants on this level. No mention of a human fighter." Daniel's voice was quiet but firm when he finally spoke. "I'm not a fighter anymore." The rebel leader gave a short laugh. "That is not what I just witnessed." The rebel commander raised his hand slightly, signaling the remaining soldiers in the hallway to hold their positions. For the moment, he seemed more interested in understanding the man standing in front of him than immediately attacking again. "You are only one man," the rebel leader continued. "You have delayed us, but the outcome will not change. Eventually, you will fall, and we will take the children." Daniel did not step back. "Not today." The leader's visor glowed brighter, as if scanning Daniel's posture and movements. "You know what we want," he said calmly. "This is not personal. We only need the heirs. Move aside and you may live." For a brief moment, the room fell silent. Then Daniel slowly shook his head. Behind him, the children remained still, watching the strange armored figures through small openings between the storage containers. They could not understand the words being spoken, but they understood that the human standing in front of them was protecting them. The rebel leader sighed quietly, almost disappointed. "Very well," he said. He raised his weapon again. But before either side could move, a sudden loud explosion echoed somewhere above them in the palace. The entire building trembled slightly. Both Daniel and the rebel soldiers paused as new alarms activated through the corridor speakers. "Security forces responding to breach in Sector 3. Footsteps and shouting voices echoed from distant hallways. The palace guards had finally organized their response. The rebel leader turned his helmet slightly toward the sound of approaching security forces. For the first time since entering the corridor, his calm posture showed a hint of urgency. The element of surprise that had allowed the rebels to infiltrate the palace was quickly disappearing. He looked back toward Daniel again. "You bought them time," the rebel leader said quietly. Daniel remained silent. The leader lowered his weapon slowly. But this empire will fall eventually," he added before stepping backward toward the hallway. He signaled his remaining soldiers. "Retreat." The rebels began pulling their wounded fighters away from the doorway while covering the corridor with their weapons. Within seconds, they disappeared into the dark hallway, moving quickly through the maintenance sector before the palace security teams could reach them. The sudden silence that followed felt almost unreal. Daniel remained standing for several seconds, listening carefully to make sure the attackers were truly gone. Only after he heard the distant sounds of royal guards moving through the corridor did he finally relax his grip on the plasma cutter. Moments later, heavily armored palace guards rushed into the hallway outside the room, and their weapons were raised as they checked the corridor for remaining enemies. When they saw the damaged doorway and the fallen rebel soldiers still lying nearby, several guards immediately moved toward the maintenance room. One of them froze when he saw the scene inside. The human janitor standing in the center of the room, the destroyed tools and equipment scattered across the floor, and the 4 royal children hiding safely behind the storage crates. Within minutes, the corridor filled with more guards, medics, and palace officials. The emergency response team secured the area, while engineers began restoring the damaged security systems. Soon after, a new figure entered the hallway, Queen Zylaria herself. She had arrived in the palace only minutes earlier and had immediately been informed about the attack and the disappearance of the quadruplets from the nursery. Her royal guards escorted her quickly through the corridors until she reached the maintenance sector where the security teams had discovered the children. The moment the queen stepped into the doorway of the damaged room, she stopped. Her eyes moved across the destruction inside the maintenance area. Broken tools and scorched walls showed clear signs of battle. Then she saw the children. The quadruplets immediately ran toward her. The queen knelt down and held them tightly, relief washing across her face as she realized they were unharmed. For a moment, she simply held them close, her royal composure replaced by the quiet emotion of a mother who had feared the worst. Only after confirming that all 4 children were safe did she slowly stand again. Her attention turned toward the human standing nearby. Daniel Carter lowered his head respectfully as the queen studied him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the queen quietly asked the palace guards a simple question. "Who protected my children?" The guards looked at Daniel. The queen followed their gaze. And in that moment she realized something shocking. The man who had saved the heirs of the empire was the palace janitor. The queen's unexpected decision. The maintenance corridor slowly returned to order as palace guards secured the area and escorted the remaining staff away from the damaged sector. Engineers worked quickly to repair the broken security panels, while medics checked the wounded guards and captured rebels who had been left behind during the retreat. What had begun as a quiet night inside the palace had turned into one of the most dangerous security breaches the royal family had ever faced. Inside the maintenance room, Queen Zylaria stood calmly with her 4 children beside her, though the tension in her eyes revealed how close the empire had come to losing its future. The quadruplets held tightly to their mother's royal cloak, clearly relieved now that the danger had passed. The queen gently placed her hands on their shoulders, reassuring them that everything was under control again. But her attention soon returned to the man standing quietly near the workbench. Daniel Carter. The human janitor, who had been cleaning palace corridors only hours earlier, now stood in the middle of a destroyed maintenance room that looked more like a battlefield than a service station. The floor was covered with broken tools and damaged equipment. Energy scorch marks lined the walls, and the remains of rebel weapons lay scattered near the doorway. Queen Zylaria slowly walked toward him, while the palace guard stepped aside. The room fell completely silent as the ruler of the empire studied the human who had protected her children. "You removed them from the nursery before the attack began," the queen said calmly. Daniel nodded slightly. "Yes, Your Majesty." The queen continued looking around the room. "And you fought the attackers alone?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. I did what I could." The queen turned her eyes back toward him, clearly analyzing every detail of the scene. She had ruled the Aurelian Empire for many years, and she was used to understanding people quickly. The broken equipment, the disabled traps, and the fallen rebel soldiers in the corridor told a clear story. This human had not simply defended the room. He had prepared for battle. "Where did you learn to fight like this?" the queen asked. Daniel remained quiet for a moment before answering honestly. "I used to be a soldier," he said. Several palace officials in the corridor exchanged surprised glances. Until that moment, most of them had believed Daniel was simply a maintenance worker who had been hired to clean the lower levels of the palace. The queen studied him carefully. "And now you clean floors?" she asked. Daniel gave a small, humble shrug. "After the war, I decided I'd rather build things and fix things instead of destroying them." The queen nodded slowly, clearly thinking about his answer. Behind her, the palace security commander stepped forward and spoke quietly. "Your Majesty, the attackers appear to be part of the rebel faction operating in the outer systems. Their leader escaped before our forces arrived, but several soldiers have been captured." The queen listened carefully before replying. "Begin a full investigation. Someone inside the palace helped them disable our security systems." The commander bowed and quickly left to organize the search for the traitor. When the room became quiet again, the queen looked back at Daniel. "My children trust you," she said. At that moment, one of the quadruplets walked forward and grabbed Daniel's hand again, exactly as the child had done earlier. The small alien looked up at the queen and spoke excitedly in their language while pointing at the human. The queen listened for a moment, then allowed a small smile to appear. "They say you played games with them while hiding," she explained. Daniel smiled slightly. "They were very brave." The queen turned toward the palace guards standing near the doorway. "Send word to the royal council. I will address them in the throne hall tomorrow morning." The guards nodded and immediately began transmitting the order. The following morning, the entire royal court gathered inside the great throne hall of Aurelion. Nobles, military commanders, and advisors filled the enormous chamber, in all waiting to hear the queen explain the events of the previous night. News of the palace attack had already spread through the capital city, and rumors were moving quickly across the empire. At the center of the hall, Queen Zylaria stood beside the royal throne while her 4 children sat nearby under heavy protection. Daniel Carter stood quietly near the entrance, still wearing the same simple maintenance uniform he had worn the night before. The queen raised her hand, and the hall became silent. "Last night," she began, "our enemies attempted to destroy the future of this empire by attacking my children." The nobles listened carefully as she continued. "The rebels believed they could succeed by striking from the shadows and disabling our defenses." She paused briefly before finishing the statement. They were wrong." The queen turned slightly and gestured toward Daniel. One man noticed the danger before anyone else. Every eye in the hall turned toward the human janitor. "He removed my children from the nursery before the attackers arrived. He hid them, and when the rebels found him, he stood alone and fought them until my guards could reach the area." Whispers spread quietly through the court as the nobles realized what the queen was saying. Queen Zylaria continued speaking. "For years, many of our people have believed that humans were unpredictable outsiders. Some even believed they could not be trusted inside our empire." She looked directly at Daniel. "But last night, a human protected the heirs of Aurelion when our own defenses failed." The hall remained silent as everyone waited for her next words. But the queen raised her voice slightly. "Therefore, I have made a decision." The nobles leaned forward in anticipation. "From this day forward, Daniel Carter will no longer serve as a palace janitor." The queen stepped down from the throne platform and walked toward him. Instead of standing above him as a ruler, she stopped directly in front of him. "I appoint Daniel Carter as royal guardian of the Quadruplets." Gasps of surprise echoed across the hall. The position of royal guardian was one of the highest honors in the empire, normally given only to elite commanders with decades of military service. Yet the queen had just given that title to a human janitor. The quadruplets immediately ran toward Daniel and hugged him again, clearly happy with the decision. The queen smiled slightly as she watched them. "Sometimes," she said calmly, "the greatest protector in the empire is the one nobody notices." And from that day forward, the story spread across the galaxy. A story about how an alien queen returned home early and discovered that the man cleaning her palace had saved the future of her entire empire.